Thank you all for being here. It is Friday afternoon at the end of a couple days where you have probably had your heads crammed full of all kinds of stuff. So I appreciate you being here. In honor of those of you who are attending, Schneider has agreed to an all-expense-paid trip for all of you to anywhere in this room, okay? So feel free to get comfortable and move around. My name is Steve Wilhite, and I have the privilege and honor of leading the Energy and Sustainability Services Group for Schneider. In case you couldn't tell from my accent, I am based in the US. I'm from the US, and pleased to be with you here. The team that I have the privilege of leading is a global team of a couple thousand people spread out around the world, and we are all focused and passionate on this, in this area of energy and sustainability services. So what I want to do for the next little while is focus and cover three things in this discussion. One, I want to talk about the landscape as we see it with respect to energy and sustainability with what's going on just around the world. Two, I want to talk about where we think it's going and where it's heading. And then three, just a few brief minutes on what we think we need to do collectively to be best prepared for this future ecosystem that we'll refer to throughout the discussion. So I want to cover those three things. And again, I'm thankful that you're here. I need my little clicker here somewhere. Let me make sure this one's working before we jump in. But when we think about this landscape, the electricity landscape is shifting dramatically. So you've heard other speakers talk about the fourth industrial revolution, and this electricity landscape is a prime example of what happens when an ecosystem becomes much more complex, the landscape shifts and changes, and we have emerging technologies and changing technologies in front of us, and what do we all do about it? So we see these things shifting and changing right in front of us in the context of all these other changes that have been talked about. And so what I like to do, and I do this sometimes with my kids when we're traveling, we're on a long trip, we're driving the car, and the kids inevitably say, how much longer till we get there? And so what I like to do is if I've got a couple hours to go, I say, well, think back about where we were 2 hours ago, and it'll give you a sense of how long it'll take to get to where we're going looking ahead. So when I think back on the three industrial revolutions that preceded this, and you go back to the first one, 1.0, and you think about when the steam engine and steam first came into the picture and how substantially our lives changed, right? We had transportation changed intercontinentally, or continentally at least, and you had all kinds of things and work being done and accomplished in a different manner than it was before. But it started with this steam engine, and it disrupted business models. So, you know, we didn't have to ride a horse anymore, we rode a locomotive. There were all kinds of things that changed both business model, personal, in our personal lives, and it translated into new things. The next stage of electricity took place about 100 years later. So in 1870, we saw the advent of electricity, and it started out with the central generation. We built mediocre at best distribution systems or transmission systems, distribution systems to deliver the comforts and conveniences and the necessities that came along with the advent of electricity. We go to 3.0, and it's about 100 years later when we come upon the age of the computing power. And for some of us, it's easy to remember back, but for some of us, we don't even remember at all, what it took to put a person on the moon back then. And it's hard to describe to our kids today in 4.0 that we have, each of us has more computing power in our phones and in our pockets or in our briefcases or our purses than it took to put a person on the moon just a little over 50 years ago. And so when we think about 4.0 and what's happened now, you've probably heard, you know, the conversation about IoT and what's come along with artificial intelligence. And we'll touch on this a little bit more, but, you know, robotics, you know, autonomous vehicles, quantum computing, and all of these things now that are coming to bear in Industrial 4.0 that are also impacting the electricity landscape as we know it. And what we're seeing is a blurring of the digital and the physical world. And assets themselves are being redefined. So when you look at the slide on the left-hand side, we talk about the number of IoT devices, and different studies and consultants have estimated these number of connected devices in the 8.4 billion range. I suspect that by the next time we're all together, that number could be measured at 5 to 10 times that number. In fact, my guess is we're already underestimating the number of actual connected things or connected devices that can impact us globally. So I want you to keep that in mind as you think about the number of connected products or the number of connected things in your businesses, your workplace, your homes, all of those things that are being disrupted and changed, whether we want to acknowledge or think differently about it or not. According to a McKinsey study, the amount of artificial intelligence and the investment in artificial intelligence globally is going through the roof. If you just think about China alone, you might think about a highly efficient labor market, easy access to labor, but to be sinking the kind of money into artificial intelligence to make that labor force even more effective, more efficient, more focused is astounding. So there's a lot of investment pouring into this. The amount of decentralized energy, again, referring back to China, roughly 2/3 of the new global capacity being brought online in 2016 alone was solar, with more than half of that being in China. So we see new assets and new devices coming into play into the grid and mixing with the grid in a completely different way than what we've seen in the past. Energy storage growing from 5 to 300 gigawatt hours from 2016 to 2030. Again, a massive difference when you think about the amount of connections and what impact and influence that'll have on the grid. Then you layer in on top of that this concept of blockchain. You've probably heard this referenced a few times before, but think of it as distributed ledger technology. This is where a day will come where I'll be able to pick up my phone and transact with a neighbor in much the same way we might transact with Amazon or anything else that we might buy from. But this peer-to-peer technology and blockchain technology overlaying against all of this change around the technology itself is going to be massive. So we step back and think, okay, so what impact will this have on the overall energy ecosystem? And I love this view from above from the night sky. This doesn't look a whole lot different in the last few decades for sure, other than there's probably more light. It might be delivered more efficiently, but it might be brighter. There might be greater growth in urban populations, obviously, with more cities. But at the end of the day, it doesn't look a whole lot different. Largely unchanged over the last 100 years. The most substantial change has really been around the business model. So we've seen liberalized markets or deregulated markets where it's not just the central generator or a vertically integrated utility business where it's produced, transmitted, and distributed to our businesses and our homes in any different way. So we see largely unchanged other than that business model change. But all of that underneath it is about to change, and it's going to be very different. So when we think about the energy ecosystem of the future, you might have heard a few other folks talk about this term called mesh grid. Many companies out there are already taking advantage of microgrid technology and having small grids within their facility or their homes or nano grids or technologies like this connected to their IoT devices or personal devices or their HVAC systems or lighting systems, et cetera. But the idea here is that rather than it being a unidirectional, vertically integrated utility business where energy is generated, transmitted, and distributed down to the end device, all of a sudden now what we see is energy and assets beginning to mesh. So they largely become indistinguishable. So what we have is just billions and billions of assets being connected to a grid, some producing, some consuming, and in fact, some of the same assets producing or consuming at different times. And so that's why we refer to this as a decentralized open ecosystem that enables the exchange of energy on a peer-to-peer and dynamic balancing of supply and demand assets. They're going to create new revenue streams. So people that might not have been producers in the past are producers now. Every one of you in one way, shape, or form is a producer right now because of the battery that you have in your phone or in your iPad or in your laptop. You are producing. You connect that smart device to the grid, and all of a sudden, you can make decisions about when you produce or when you consume. And this is what we refer to as we talk about this mesh grid ecosystem, of the future. I want to pause just for a moment as we think about how a mesh grid type of ecosystem can disrupt different business models, and I'm going to use an analogy or comparison to another industry. Hopefully you're all familiar with the video rental industry. In the US, we had the Blockbuster video rental. I can't see everybody, but anybody familiar with that? Hopefully you're familiar with the video rental type of business. So here's what would happen with this. Every Friday, my wife and I would argue about who was going to have to stop by Blockbuster on the way home. We'd talk about what movie we wanted to watch, what we were gonna see, and then one of us, we'd flip a coin and decide who's gonna stop and pick up. And what would happen when you get to Blockbuster? You'd walk in, and where would you go? You'd go to the new release section, right? Because it was the new movies that you wanted to see. And more often than not, what would be missing? You'd find the new movie that you wanted to see, an empty shelf, they'd all be out, right? So you'd get frustrated, and eventually you work your way down to that movie that was released 10 years ago that you've already seen 3 or 4 times. So you'd pick up a handful, and you'd go home, and that's what you had. So that was Blockbuster. So Blockbuster said, we're gonna figure this out. So we're gonna start adding more videos to the shelf, more new releases so that people would have, but they were still gone. So what you found yourself doing was going in and standing next to the return portion, hoping that maybe your movie was gonna get returned right when you happen to be at the store so you could get what you want. Well, Netflix steps in and says, you know what, we're gonna solve this. We're gonna upend this thing, we're gonna change it. So rather than you having to go to the store, you sign up for the movie that you want, you order it, and it'll appear in your mail, all right? And so my wife and I did that for a while. So in the mail, we'd get 2 or 3 DVDs would show up, we'd watch them, a week later, we'd mail them back. In the meantime, what Blockbuster did, in response to Netflix, was say, okay, we're just gonna keep adding videos to the store, to the shelf, and we're gonna change late fees. So we're gonna make it easier for customers to keep the video longer so that they can watch it. Well, what it did is drove up frustration amongst the consumers. So what Blockbuster was doing was trying to incrementally deal with the disruption that was coming from Netflix. What did Netflix do? Netflix said, not only are we going to continue doing what we're doing to Blockbuster, but they said, we're going to disrupt our own business model, and that's where streaming came into play. So they completely disrupted the mail order approach to DVDs, and they said, we're going to stream video. And it was only about 30 days ago, maybe 60 days ago, that the last Blockbuster of the 2,000 or 3,000 that were in the US closed its doors. Okay, the last one closed its doors, it's done. What did Blockbuster do? They tried to incrementally deal with the disruption, whereas Netflix was busy disrupting themselves. And so they came in and said, we're gonna keep changing. We're not gonna deal with the ecosystem of old. We're gonna look ahead and deal with a new ecosystem and create a new ecosystem that's gonna be completely different. Okay, and you see the quote up here by Reed Hastings, and I wanna read the fuller version of this quote. He said, short-term optimization is about being efficient, and it becomes the death of long-term success and innovation. We should build a company in Netflix that tolerates some short-term chaos, and we want to manage right on the edge of that chaos. And the value of that is keeping and stimulating the amazing thinkers, so when the market shifts, like DVD to streaming or license to expand to original content, we have within Netflix all kinds of original thinkers. And that's the long-term optimization that all of us in our organization want. So what did Netflix do? Netflix embraced the chaos. They embraced the changing ecosystem. And they said, we're going to disrupt it ourselves. And really, that's what leaders do. So what happens is some of us really have to be pushed to the edge before we're going to take action. Blockbuster was pushed so hard, and the action they took was just try to be safer. Try to be safer. Let me get late fees. You know, do away with late fees. Let me put more videos on the rental, and that will solve it. And it didn't solve it. It actually just extended their death. And so I would say to you as leaders, and each one of us in our companies are leaders in our own rights, we need to find ways to push ourselves into the area of discomfort. And if we're really going to lead, we need to be learning. And if we're going to be learning, in the words of Reed Hastings, the Netflix co-founder, you need to get on the edge of chaos and see what is that picture going to look like, and how am I going to lead through it if I'm really going to take advantage of it? And so leaders in these situations will tend to see around the corner and see what's coming and prepare their companies like Reed. Now, I wish I had invested in Netflix because it's been one of the most great investment stories and continues to be, but I love this idea that you have to be on the edge of chaos. Now, translate that back into energy. And what are we going to do about this, and how do we go about it? And this mesh grid ecosystem that we're referring to is going to be a global change. It's going to come at us from every direction. It's going to move at different paces. It's not going to move at the same pace around the world everywhere, largely because you have regulatory infrastructure or regulatory constraints that will cause it to either move faster at times or slower at other times. But it's going to happen, and it's going to happen globally. There's nothing we can do to stop that. So if that's the case, then we as leaders need to figure out how do we get out there on the edge of chaos and deal with it and take advantage of it and create new business models and new revenue streams and new business streams from it. So let me just give you a few examples when you think globally. Right here in Singapore, a company called Electrify has a pilot program where they're implementing peer-to-peer and block trade, or blockchain, I should say, trading amongst peers, where people can trade energy and exchange energy between themselves. And so this is saving consumers, I think it's measured in the $1 million to $2 million now range, but they're doing it on a pilot basis for businesses and consumers. Another example is Vanderbron in the Netherlands. That's a residential example where in your home, you might have solar with battery backup, and literally you can take your phone and exchange with your neighbor. I'm on vacation, but the sun is still shining, and my photovoltaics are creating energy, and I can sell that to a neighbor down the street using the peer-to-peer trading platform that they put in place. So these type of experiments are happening. GreenSync, if any of you are familiar with in Australia, has about 37 partners on its platform. Similar experiment where they're trading energy between themselves as opposed to having to go through the vertically integrated utility or supplier approach, but they have that platform in place to be able to do this. And then you see others like BlueScope in Australia just did one of the recent biggest purchase power agreements directly with the developer. It's a business model that's been highly utilized in the US in the last decade or so. Rather than simply putting the renewable energy on the grid, it's doing a direct deal between the developer and the end user. And BlueScope has now done one of these new innovative deals in Australia in a similar manner. So today's innovations are shaping tomorrow's opportunities, and my encouragement to you would be to think about, what does this mesh grid ecosystem mean to you? Each one of us in this room, as I said, are prosumers. We are producers and we are consumers. It just depends on when we have our batteries and our devices plugged in and when we're actually using them and consuming from them. So this mesh grid ecosystem, and what you see in the picture is this depiction of literally we could put billions of dots on this screen, okay? Because what's going to happen is each one of these devices, no matter how small or how large, is going to be, number one, connected. It's going to be also communicable so that it can transmit information back and forth and respond to price signals or respond to needs or dispatch differently. And ultimately, that's where you see this blending in what we call the mesh grid. Again, the blockchain will change the way the business models, but it's not going to fundamentally change how things flow on the overall system. So when you think about what you're doing to prepare, we conducted a survey with GreenBiz Research to say, okay, what are companies doing about this? And so we've got some interesting facts and figures to share. So first of all, it was interesting to see that when we posed this question to companies, are you prepared and are you ready for the change that's coming here in this space? 85% of respondents basically had the answer that said, we got this. We're in a good spot. We're prepared and we're ready. About 85%. I was actually very surprised at the number that was that high. But when you look underneath it, it's a little bit different. So roughly 44% say that a lack of coordinated planning between different constituents and different groups within the organization will be a barrier to being able to take advantage of this and get something positive accomplished. Only 40% of these companies have a global data management strategy. As an example, a number of people just in the last day and a half or so have come through the Energy and Sustainability Services section, and I continue to be surprised how many people are still working hard to collect data at a facility level that they might have 1,000 sites or so, and it doesn't roll up somewhere where they can capture all of that data, not just at a facility level, but down to the device level, in order to know what they have so that they can take advantage of it in a different type of ecosystem. So only 40% say they really have a good handle around that global data management strategy, and I think we're serving about 38 or 39% of those companies. And then on the far right, you see 30% of companies are considering advanced systems like energy storage or demand response to be able to take advantage of it. And so while they might say we've got this, underneath it, it's not necessarily well prepared or well thought out about what to do about it. I'm going to give you a case in point. Many years ago, I was an energy manager for a large forest products company. And there was a freeze across the southern part of the US that shut in the gas. At this particular paper mill, we had our gas flowing. But on that day, it was actually 2 or 3 days of the freeze, the prices of the natural gas went through the roof. And what I found out after the fact, and I went back to the mill manager with this, was we could have made more money in the 3 days taking the gas that we were using to make the steam in our process. We could have taken that gas for those 3 days and put that back on the grid and made more money in 3 days than we would make in 6 months of producing paper at that paper mill, okay? So I thought I was gonna be a hero by sharing this with the mill manager. In fact, the mill manager was very irritated with me, and the reason he was irritated with me is because I didn't have him prepared. Had I had him prepared, he would have sent all his people home and made more money in those 3 days. Everybody would have hit their bonus targets that year. It would have been a dramatic difference had I simply had him prepared to do what he could do economically and still serve his customers in a very adequate way. And so I think a lot of companies were heading into this thinking, oh, this is new, cool technology. This is great that we have access to all this stuff, but we're really not doing what we need to do as leaders to prepare for the chaos that Reed Hastings suggested that we operate at the edge of. And so we have to ask ourselves, what's it going to take? And so the third piece of what I want to talk about just for a few minutes in the time I have left here is it's going to take a new way of thinking. And I want to describe this based on a couple different constituents. And I want to start with us at Schneider. When we think about the convergence that's taking place in the framework, we use this term active energy management. And when we're talking about that, it really encompasses these 3 key things. Instead of historically thinking about procurement in one category, and another category, how I'm operating, how efficiently I'm operating, and then in another category, how sustainable my business is becoming, our hypothesis is that all 3 of these things are converging in what we call active energy management. And I would suggest to you that every one of us here in this room, whether it's personal or in our business, is on a journey. Okay, we are all on this journey of convergence. The only question is, where are we on the journey? And what I mean by that as an example is, I might go to your organization and I might find myself talking to a chief procurement officer about how we might be able to help you buy more effectively. Many of you might not know, but Schneider is one of the largest third-party buyers of energy on behalf of our clients in the world. I think today we're purchasing close to 40 billion euro, probably between 35 and 40 billion euro of energy for our clients. We don't buy it and resell it, but we're buying it in the client's name and managing it globally for them. We might talk to the chief procurement officer about that, and then we might turn around and talk to a completely different part of the organization about the sustainability footprint. So today, we are producing the carbon footprint for AT&T. We're taking all this data and information and producing the carbon footprint for that company that goes into their corporate sustainability reports, their CDP reporting, et cetera. But that's a completely different part of the organization. And then we might turn around and go talk to the operational side of the business about how they can run their facilities more efficiently, what kind of technologies and data capture and all of those things that might make them consume more efficiently. So that's the journey that many of us are on, and we're at different stages. Today, many companies and entities that we're dealing with, we're talking to the same group, or they've become much more integrated in the way they think about this. And that's where the future is. To think about these things in discrete bubbles, the way we've thought about it historically, will not be sufficient. We have to think about these things in a coordinated fashion. What I mean by that is, it's not enough just to go buy the amount of kilowatt hours or MMBTUs or whatever the measurement may be of what you bought last year. You've got to think about your consumption patterns and behaviors, how much flexibility you have built into your operations so that you know when you're going to consume and what you're going to consume and how much you're willing to pay for it. So this fundamental convergence has begun, and you are all on that journey. And the only question is, where are you on your journey in that respect? Are you on the left-hand side where those are still being dealt with in a very discrete fashion? Or is it becoming more integrated in the way in which you treat those things? When I think about Schneider ourselves, you've heard us talk a lot about EcoStruxure and how we think about intelligent data for intelligent decisions. And so this is not just stuff that's being sold to you out in the innovation hub. So if you've been here for a day and a half, you've heard about EcoStruxure. I'm certain of that. Okay, but this is not just something that we apply to you. This is something that we've systematically gone through and applied at each one of our facilities, where we're capturing a greater and greater and a finer and finer level of detailed data and information, providing analytics around that data and information, some of it being predictive analytics, and then taking that information and using it in multiple ways. We'll use it to buy better. We'll use it to consume more efficiently. We'll use it to, in a much more real-time fashion, playing off the optionality that exists in our processes and in our business to help us produce the products that we produce much more economically and much more sustainably. So the same things that you've heard about, we're applying to ourselves. So that's one of the things that we're doing to get ready. Just a few examples from a few of our clients. Iron Mountain, you can see on the slide, enhances sustainability value to its customers. It's a leader in information management and data centers, applying holistic approach to clean energy targets. Well, this is really an interesting company because they really move fast on the journey from going from treating it in a very discrete, the 3 bubbles in a very discrete fashion, to bringing it together in an integrated fashion and saying, okay, let me start at a few sites. They found savings by getting on better rates and better tariffs that we worked with them on. But now they're sitting here saying, let's consider a couple hundred megawatts of renewable energy. We're exploring that option. By next year, they'll have 1,100 sites all captured where they're getting the data, some of it in real time, some of it static utility data, but they're capturing the data and information so they really understand their footprint well, and then can look at where should we apply the flexibility, what options do we have, and how do we reduce our footprint and reduce our spend at the same time. Another example, BlueScope Steel, I mentioned earlier with some of the PPA work, they just executed a 7-year, 88 megawatt offsite solar PPA. And this is going to substantially reduce their footprint, and actually it's going to be very cost effective for them financially as well. Large beverage company, who will go nameless, but I almost guarantee every one of you have taken a drink from or drank one of their products at least, if not today, this week, I'm sure. And so what they did is a much more integrated approach where they looked at both the operational savings, the OpEx reduction you see there at 6 sites. 2% sounds small, but it was operationally, there's no CapEx required. It was simply changing some minor behaviors in the facility. They executed an off-site 10-year PPA, replacing 60% of the power requirement at one site, and then doing some on-site solar contracting business with paybacks that were very good. So this is a company that said, we want the flexibility, we want resiliency, we want security of supply, and we want to combine all these things. It sounds like they want their cake and eat it too, so to speak, but able to look at each one of these different pieces and how it converges and how they can take advantage of the overall marketplace they have to deal in. And then Novellus, another example. This is a company that when they first started taking a look at this, it was really looking at it through an efficiency lens. How much can I save? What's the financial benefit? Once they gained security and confidence that the savings were really there and the opportunities were really there, it allowed them to be much more aggressive in saying, all right, I'm ready to step out there and make stronger statements about what my sustainability strategy, what my targets will be, and all of those sorts of things. It gave them the confidence to be able to step out there and make those statements. Many companies step out there and say, we're going to reduce our carbon by 20% or 30% or X amount by 2020, 2030, 2040, some say 2050, because they're less confident in what they're going to achieve. So a lot of that's based on what's my competitor or what's the person down the street doing. In Novellus' case, because they had good, solid data and experience and had the confidence in knowing what they could achieve, they felt much better about moving forward with very specific targets that they could go after. So each one of these companies are at different stages of their journey, and they're combining different pieces of this. And now they're preparing for the coming energy mesh grid ecosystem to say, what can I do and what do I need to do to become much more flexible in my operation, and how can I take advantage of this? So just to wrap up, each one of us have to prepare for this mesh grid of the future. And so as you think about the devices you have and the current landscape, these devices in your buildings, in your homes, in your process, in your manufacturing sites are all blending in such a way that the difference between a consuming and producing asset is going to become much grayer and much blurrier. And the question for each of us as leaders, are we pushing ourselves and our organizations to the point where we are really going to learn from being at the edge of this chaos, or are we going to be in a position where we're having to react like Blockbuster did by simply adjusting my late fees or trying to put more video rentals on the shelf? I, for one, would rather be with Netflix, where we're operating at the edge of chaos, and we're learning from it, and we're going to make some mistakes from it. But ultimately, in the long run, we'll be successful because we've learned how to adapt and how to deal with it. So it's Friday. I thank you all for your attention. As I said before, you still have that all-expense-paid trip here anywhere in this room that's on Schneider. So thanks all of you for being part of this.